Some of these records were born out of humiliation, rejection, even a busted recording contract. Yet they didn't just climb the charts, they defined an entire era, and decades later, they still fill dance floors and heartbreak playlists in equal measure. Today, we're counting down 12 of the best-selling, most legendary rhythm and blues songs released between 1960 and 1980, and the true stories behind them are wilder than the songs themselves. Let's begin. Number 12, Brick House, The Commodores, 1977.
She's mighty, just letting it all hang out.
The Commodores had already been building momentum for years by 1977. They'd broken through after opening for the Jackson 5 back in 1972, and by the mid-70s, they were racking up hits like Machine Gun and Slippery When Wet. But nothing prepared them for what happened almost by accident during one ordinary studio session.
She's a brick house.
Their equipment broke down mid-recording, and while the crew scrambled to fix it, bass player Ronald LaPred started noodling on a riff, just killing time. One by one, the rest of the band drifted in and joined him, and by pure accident, they'd stumbled onto a groove nobody had planned. Producer James Carmichael knew instantly it was something special, so he sent guitarist William King home with the tape, with one job: write some lyrics. King fell asleep trying.
Brick house.
But his wife, Shirley Hannah King, stayed up, and by morning, there was a full set of lyrics sitting on his chest, built around a cleaned-up version of an old Southern expression about a woman who's, well, built like a brick house. King brought it back to the band the next day and let everyone believe he'd written it himself. They loved it so much, they handed lead vocals not to Lionel Richie, but to drummer Walter Clyde Orange, whose growl gave the song its swagger, with Richie contributing saxophone instead.
She knows she's built and knows how to please.
Brick House climbed to number 5 on the pop chart and number 4 on the R&B chart, becoming one of the most sampled funk records in music history. And Shirley Hannah King, the woman who actually wrote the words while her husband slept, only received her rightful songwriting credit decades later.
Ain't holding nothing back now.
Number 11, War, Edwin Starr, 1970. By 1970, Motown's songwriting powerhouse Norman Whitfield had a problem on his hands, a song too dangerous to release. He and Barrett Strong had written War back in 1969, and it landed on the Temptations' album, Psychedelic Shack, as a blistering statement against Vietnam, sung as more of a defiant chant than a lead vocal showcase. Word spread fast. According to Motown legend, somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000 college students wrote directly to the label, demanding the song be released as a single. But label boss Berry Gordy panicked. The Temptations were Motown's biggest, most polished act, and a politically explosive protest anthem felt like a career risk not worth taking with the label's crown jewels. So Whitfield made a bold move. He kept the song but swapped the singer. Edwin Starr, a newer artist who'd only recently joined Motown when the label bought out his old imprint, Rick Tick, had far less to lose. Whitfield rebuilt the track from the ground up, heavier guitars, thicker horns, a full-scale production, and told Starr to bring everything he had. Starr didn't hold back. That raw shouted, "Good God, y'all," wasn't in the original arrangement at all. It was Starr improvising in the booth, channeling real, unscripted fury. Released in June 1970, War rocketed to number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100 for 3 weeks, sold over 3 million copies, and earned a gold disc. It became the most successful protest song ever to top the American charts. A journeyman singer, nobody expected to headline history, became, almost overnight, the voice of a generation demanding an answer to one simple, furious question. What is it good for? Number 10. Love Train, The O'Jays, 1972. By the early 1970s, the O'Jays had been grinding for 15 years with barely a hit to show for it. The group started out as a doo-wop act in Canton, Ohio, cycling through names like the Mascots and the Triumphs before settling on the O'Jays. And for over a decade, success stayed frustratingly out of reach. They'd nearly quit more than once. Then they signed with Kenny Gamble and Leon Huff's brand new label, Philadelphia International Records, a company the pair had deliberately modeled on Motown's assembly line hit factory. Everything changed almost immediately. Their first single together, Backstabbers, became a #1 R&B hit in 1972. But it was the follow-up that made history. Gamble and Huff wrote Love Train as a simple, sweeping plea for global unity, name-checking Russia, China, Egypt, and Israel in the same breath. An astonishingly bold move for a mainstream pop single in 1972. In an almost eerie coincidence, it entered the Billboard Top 40 the very same week the Paris Peace Accords were signed, as if the timing itself had been written in the stars. Recorded at Sigma Sound Studios with the legendary Philly house band MFSB, laying down that churning proto-disco groove, the song rode the O'Jays' rich three-part harmonies straight to #1 on both the pop and R&B charts, the group's first, and remarkably only, pop chart topper after a decade and a half of trying. It was certified gold by the RIA and later inducted into the Grammy Hall of Fame. Solid proof that sometimes the biggest hit of your career arrives right when you're most ready to give up completely. Number 9. Stand By Me, Ben E. King, 1961.
And the land is dark, and the
Before he was a solo star, Ben E. King, born Benjamin Earl Nelson in Henderson, North Carolina, and raised in Harlem, was the voice of the Drifters, singing lead on hits like There Goes My Baby and Save the Last Dance for Me. Then, in 1960, a contract dispute pushed him out the door.
stand by me. If the
Determined to make it on his own, King auditioned for legendary songwriters Jerry Lieber and Mike Stoller with a handful of songs he'd already written for his old group, including one the Drifters had flatly rejected.
should tumble and fall, or
King had grown up steeped in church music, and the song drew directly from that world, inspired by a 1905 gospel hymn rooted in the words of Psalm 46, and by a similar spiritual called Stand By Me, Father, recorded by Sam Cooke's group, The Soul Stirrers. King sang the beginnings of it a cappella, right there in the office. Stoller sat down at the piano and worked out the chords on the spot, building that unmistakable walking bass line while Lieber helped shape the remaining lyrics. In under an hour, three men had written one of the most covered songs in music history. Released in 1961, it climbed to number 4 in the U.S., and 25 years later, after appearing in a coming-of-age film that borrowed its title, it shot all the way to number 1 in the UK. It was later performed at the royal wedding of Prince Harry and Meghan Markle in 2018, and King himself was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 1988. Over 500 artists have covered Stand By Me since that first recording, but nobody has ever quite topped the original.
stand by me. If the sky
Number 8. Superstition, Stevie Wonder, 1972. Here's something most people don't know. Superstition wasn't supposed to belong to Stevie Wonder at all. By 1972, Wonder had grown from the child prodigy known as Little Stevie Wonder into a fiercely independent artist, demanding full creative control at Motown. and he'd just landed a coveted opening slot on the Rolling Stones World Tour, exposing him to an entirely new rock audience. Around that same time, guitarist Jeff Beck was invited into the studio to play on Wonder's new album, Talking Book, and in exchange, Stevie promised to write him an original song. One day, while Wonder stepped out of the room, Beck sat down at the drums and started messing around, just killing time. When Stevie walked back in, he told Beck to keep the beat going, and right there, on the spot, he began improvising a funky clavinet riff over the top. Beck was floored. He later said, he thought, "He's given me the riff of the century." The plan was for Beck's new power trio to release the song first, but their album got delayed, and Motown chief Berry Gordy, sensing a guaranteed #1 when he heard it, insisted Stevie keep it for himself and rush it onto Talking Book instead. Wonder ended up playing nearly every instrument on the final track himself: the Hohner clavinet, the drums, even the Moog bass line. Released as the album's lead single in October 1972, Superstition debuted modestly at number 82 before climbing all the way to #1, and it won Wonder 2 Grammy Awards, Best Rhythm and Blues Song and Best Male R&B Vocal Performance, for a song that was never even meant to be his. Number 7. Let's Stay Together, Al Green, 1971. Al Green almost didn't record his signature song, and he'd nearly given up on music entirely before it saved his career. Early on, Green scored a minor hit called Back Up Train, and it followed him everywhere. Some venues literally billed him as Al, Back Up Train Green. His momentum stalled fast until a chance gig in Midland, Texas put him on the same bill as bandleader Willie Mitchell, who ran High Records in Memphis and heard something irresistible in Green's raw voice. In late 1971, Mitchell and drummer Al Jackson Jr. had cooked up a groove in the studio, but had no words for it. When they played it for Green, he grabbed a pen and paper, disappeared for a few minutes, and came back with the entire lyric to Let's Stay Together, written in roughly 5 minutes flat. Turning it into a finished record was a different story entirely. Green wanted to belt it out with power. Mitchell kept pushing him toward something softer, more vulnerable. "Don't try to handle the song," he told him. "Just let it happen." The two argued for 2 straight days. Green even hated his own finished vocal, convinced his falsetto sounded thin and weak. Mitchell disagreed completely. So completely that he had percussionist Howard Grimes model the song's conga groove after Budweiser's Clydesdale horses clopping in a Christmas commercial, and pressed 500,000 copies before the single even reached stores. The record came out on a Monday, and by Thursday it had already gone gold. Let's Stay Together shot to #1 on both the pop and R&B charts, stayed atop the R&B chart for 9 straight weeks, and turned Al Green from a struggling singer into Memphis soul royalty.
Yeah, I just came to see.
Number 6. Le Freak, Chic, 1978.
Big fun to be had by everyone.
Le Freak is one of the biggest disco anthems ever recorded, and it began as an insult that was never meant for radio. Nile Rodgers and Bernard Edwards had met years earlier as New York session musicians, scored an early disco hit as part of a group called the Big Apple Band, and eventually formed Chic, landing a deal with Atlantic Records after struggling for years to get anyone to take a chance on them. On New Year's Eve 1977, the pair were personally invited to Studio 54 by supermodel Grace Jones. But when they arrived, their names weren't on the guest list, and the doorman turned them away, twice. Furious and freezing outside New York's most famous nightclub, Rodgers and Edwards went home, cracked open a bottle of champagne, and started jamming out their frustration on guitar and bass. The chant they came up with was blunt and unprintable, a raw expletive aimed squarely at the doorman who'd humiliated them.
Out on the floor.
Realizing radio would never touch that phrase, they softened it first to freak off, then landed on the far catchier freak out, and dressed the whole thing up in French flair, le fric, c'est chic, turning their public humiliation into pure dance floor gold. Released in September 1978, the song topped the Billboard Hot 100 an astonishing 3 separate times, sold roughly 7 million copies, and became Atlantic Records' best-selling single in the label's history. It was later inducted into both the Grammy Hall of Fame and the Library of Congress's National Recording Registry. Studio 54 kept Chic outside its doors that New Year's Eve, but Le Freak walked straight through every door in the world afterward. Number 5, My Girl, The Temptations, 1965. Smokey Robinson wrote My Girl for a voice he couldn't stop thinking about, and it wasn't his own. In 1964, while touring alongside the Temptations on a package tour that stopped at the Apollo Theater, Robinson became convinced the group had a sleeping giant in singer David Ruffin, whose rough, pleading tone he felt was being wasted on background harmonies, while other members handled lead vocals. Right there during the tour, Robinson sat down with fellow Miracle Ronald White and wrote a song, built specifically to showcase Ruffin's voice, sweet and gentle, nothing like the demanding tone Ruffin usually brought to a stage. As Motown's most in-demand writer and producer, Robinson could easily have kept the song for his own group, The Miracles. Instead, he handed it to the Temptations, giving Ruffin his very first lead vocal with the group, backed by the Funk Brothers, including that unmistakable opening guitar lick from Robert White and James Jamerson's signature bass line. It was a gamble that paid off instantly and completely. Released in December 1964, My Girl became the Temptations' first ever #1 hit and their first million-selling single. Before this song, the group had scored only one top 20 hit. After it, they'd scored 23 more. Billboard ranked it the 10th biggest song of all of 1965, and the RISA eventually certified it 7 times platinum. It even earned Robinson a coveted $1,000 bonus from Motown founder Berry Gordy, awarded to any producer who landed a #1 record. Decades later, when asked if he regretted giving away one of the greatest love songs ever written, Robinson didn't hesitate. Were it not for the Temptations, he said, I never would have written it at all.
Tell us what's going on there, Mr. G.
Well, that's Norman Whitfield.
Number 4, I Will Survive, Gloria Gaynor, 1978. Gloria Gaynor recorded the biggest anthem of her career while wearing a back brace after a genuinely terrifying stage accident. During a live performance earlier in 1978, a tug-of-war mishap with a stage wire sent her falling backward over a monitor, and she woke up the next morning temporarily paralyzed from the waist down, requiring spinal surgery before she could even stand again. But the song's story starts even earlier, with its songwriter, Dino Fakaris. He'd just been fired from Motown after nearly 7 years on staff, and sitting jobless in his room one night, a movie theme song he'd written years before happened to play on TV. He took it as a sign, jumped up on his bed, and shouted, "I'm going to make it. I will survive." That exact line became the emotional core of the song he and Freddie Perrin wrote for Gloria Gaynor in 1978. Her record label didn't believe in it, though. They buried I Will Survive on the B-side of a cover song called Substitute and pushed that track as the single instead. Gaynor was so convinced her song deserved better that she and her husband personally delivered copies to Richie Kazor, a DJ at Studio 54, who started spinning it that same night. Word spread through New York's clubs and then to radio stations, forcing the label to officially flip the single around.
Give me strength.
I Will Survive debuted modestly at number 87, climbed all the way to number 1 in March 1979, sold over 15 million copies worldwide, and won the only Grammy ever awarded for Best Disco Recording, a category the Academy created and then quietly retired after just 1 year. Number 3, Respect, Aretha Franklin, 1967. Respect wasn't originally Aretha Franklin's song at all. It belonged to Otis Redding, who'd written and recorded it 2 years earlier as a modest hit about a man demanding appreciation at home. Franklin, who'd grown up singing gospel in her father's church in Detroit, had been performing Redding's version live for years, and in February 1967, freshly signed to Atlantic Records under producer Jerry Wexler, she walked into a New York studio, determined to make it entirely her own. Sitting at the piano with her sister Carolyn, Franklin completely flipped the song's perspective, turning a man's demand into a woman's declaration. Working with the famed Muscle Shoals rhythm section, the sisters added the now iconic spelled-out chorus, R-E-S-P-E-C-T, borrowed a saxophone break inspired by Sam and Dave's When Something Is Wrong With My Baby, and threw in the playful ad-lib Sock It To Me, a phrase already buzzing around their own neighborhood. Franklin arranged the entire recording herself, right down to the piano part. When it was released in April 1967, the song exploded, hitting number 1 on both the pop and R&B charts, reaching number 10 in the UK, and earning Franklin the first 2 of what would become 8 consecutive Grammy wins. Otis Redding himself was reportedly delighted, rather than bitter about it, joking at the Monterey Pop Festival that a girl had simply taken his song away from him. What began as Redding's minor regional hit became Aretha Franklin's signature anthem, permanently inducted into the Grammy Hall of Fame, and one of the defining songs of both the civil rights and feminist movements of the era, arriving at the exact moment America needed to hear it. Number 2, Me and Mrs. Jones, Billy Paul, 1972. Before Me and Mrs. Jones, Billy Paul, born Paul Williams in Philadelphia, had already spent nearly 2 decades chasing a hit that never came. He'd shared a stage with Charlie Parker at just 16 years old and even served in the Army alongside a young Elvis Presley without ever convincing him to join his band. He'd released 3 straight flop albums with producers Kenny Gamble and Leon Huff, each one going nowhere. Then, during a break near their Philadelphia offices, Gamble and Huff noticed something odd at a local cafe. A well-dressed older man who came in every single day, always followed 10 or 15 minutes later by a younger woman. They'd sit in the same booth, play the same songs on the jukebox, and never once explained who they were to each other. It might have been completely innocent, his daughter, a niece, anybody. But Gamble and Huff, along with co-writer Carrie Gilbert, let their imaginations run, and out of that quiet mystery came one of the boldest love songs ever recorded, a smooth, unapologetic ballad about a secret affair. Remarkably, adultery was still technically a crime under Pennsylvania law when the song was written, only decriminalized by the state legislature weeks before its release. Many radio stations refused to play something so morally unflinching without judgment attached. It didn't matter. Recorded at Sigma Sound with backing vocals from Philadelphia's legendary studio trio, the Sweethearts, Me and Mrs. Jones knocked Helen Reddy's I Am Woman out of the top spot, sold over 4.5 million copies, and won Paul a Grammy for Best Male R&B Vocal Performance, finally delivering, after all those years of trying, the biggest hit of his career. Number 1, I Heard It Through the Grapevine, Marvin Gaye, 1968. Few songs were rejected as many times as I Heard It Through the Grapevine, before it finally became a hit, songwriters Norman Whitfield and Barrett Strong first cut it with Smokey Robinson and the Miracles back in 1966. Motown boss Berry Gordy turned it down flat, telling them to make it stronger. They tried again with Marvin Gaye. Gordy rejected that version too. Even the Isley Brothers and the Temptations took a swing at it, with none of those recordings ever seeing release. It wasn't until Gladys Knight and the Pips recorded an up-tempo, gospel-charged take in late 1967 that the song finally broke through, climbing to number 2 on the pop charts and number 1 on the R&B chart. But Whitfield still wasn't satisfied. He genuinely believed Gaye's slower, moodier, more mysterious version deserved to be heard, and he pushed Gordy to quietly bury it as a deep album track on Gaye's 1968 record, In the Groove. To get the strained, aching vocal he wanted, Whitfield made Gaye sing well above his natural range, take after exhausting take, layering in echo to heighten the tension. When a Chicago radio disc jockey started spinning the album cut anyway, the request phones lit up so relentlessly that Gordy finally relented and released it as a single on October 30th, 1968. It shot straight to number 1 on both the pop and R&B charts, holding the top spot for 7 consecutive weeks, and became the biggest-selling single in Motown's history at that point, a record it held until the Jackson 5's I'll Be There arrived 20 months later. And yet, at the very moment his song was conquering the world, Marvin Gaye himself felt almost nothing. Privately devastated over the illness of his singing partner, Tammy Terrell, he later admitted the whole triumph barely felt real to him, that he didn't believe he deserved it at all.